Hello everyone, and welcome to Lumen of Ages. I am the man who has been cast in marble, painted in grand postures, and stamped onto the coins you carry in your pockets. But before the monuments, before the myths, I was simply a man of Virginia, born in 1732, tethered to the earth and the endless rivers of a wild continent. History remembers me as the first president of a new world, the commander of an impossible rebellion, and the father of a nation. Yet beneath the powdered hair and the military coats, there lived a mind plagued by doubt and a soul burdened by the heavy price of liberty. They speak of the freezing winds at Valley Forge, but they rarely speak of the silence of those dark nights when the fate of thousands rested upon my shoulders. I did not ask to be a king. In truth, I despised the very notion of crowns. All I ever truly wanted was the quiet shade of the trees at Mount Vernon. But destiny is a demanding master. When the drums of war echoed across the 13 colonies, I answered the call, leaving behind the only peace I had ever known. Over the course of 8 long, grueling years, I led a ragged army against the greatest empire on Earth. We were starved, frozen, and outgunned. Yet we possessed a spirit that artillery could not shatter. Through the freezing waters of the Delaware River to the final siege at Yorktown in 1781, I watched men bleed for an idea that had never before been tested in the fires of reality. Today, my name echoes through the halls of time, but I ask you to look past the stone and the legends. Listen to the creak of the saddle, the roar of the cannons, and the quiet prayers of a leader who stood on the edge of the abyss, holding the fragile hope of a republic in his hands. Walk with me now into the fog of the past and discover the true story of the Revolution. I am George Washington, and this is my confession. The memory of the French and Indian War still burns in my mind with the harsh scent of pine resin and freshly spilled blood. It was the summer of 1755. I was a young man, bursting with ambition, riding alongside British General Edward Braddock into the dense, suffocating green hell of the Ohio Valley. The heat was an oppressive physical weight, pressing down upon our heavy woolen coats. I remember the supreme arrogance of the British regulars, their scarlet uniforms glowing like brilliant targets against the shadowed, impenetrable foliage. I had pleaded with General Braddock to adapt our tactics, to abandon the rigid European lines and fight as the native warriors fought, concealed by the ancient oaks and the thick underbrush. But my desperate warnings were dismissed as the frightened ramblings of a colonial provincial. When the ambush finally came, it was not a traditional battle, but an utter slaughter. The forest itself seemed to erupt in deafening war whoops and a blinding storm of musket fire. I rode desperately through the chaos, the taste of bitter black powder coating my tongue and burning the back of my throat. 2 massive horses were shot from beneath me, their bodies collapsing into the muddy earth with wet, sickening thuds. I felt the air violently snap around my head as bullets tore through my hat and my coat. I found 4 bullet holes in my uniform by the end of that horrific afternoon. I watched General Braddock fall, his chest shattered by lead, his unshakable confidence draining away into the damp soil. I took command of the shattered remnants, organizing a fighting retreat through the screaming wilderness. That day, amidst the groans of dying men and the cloying metallic smell of torn flesh, I learned my first bitter lesson about the vulnerability of empires. The British Army was not invincible. It could bleed. It could break. After the war, I returned home to the gentle rolling hills of Mount Vernon. For a time, I allowed myself to believe that my days of blood and mud were behind me forever. I became a gentleman farmer. I remember the rich, loamy scent of the freshly turned Virginia soil, the sweet aroma of tobacco curing in the long wooden sheds, and the soft rustle of the Potomac River whispering against the muddy banks at twilight. The years passed in a quiet, comforting rhythm of seasons and harvests. My beloved wife, Martha, filled the grand house with the scent of dried lavender and warm beeswax. But a dark, ominous cloud was gathering across the ocean. The peace was merely an illusion. The murmurs of discontent began as a soft breeze carrying the news of the Stamp Act in 1765, and soon escalated into a howling gale of outrage. I sat in the crowded taverns of Williamsburg, sipping dark Madeira wine that suddenly tasted sharp and bitter on my tongue, while men like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson spoke fervently of tyranny, taxation, and natural rights. The British Crown, entirely blind to our growing maturity, sought to squeeze us for revenue, treating us not as free Englishmen, but as subservient, conquered subjects. When the horrific news of the massacre in Boston reached my ears, a cold, hard knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The time for polite petitions and royal appeals had passed. When I rode to Philadelphia in the spring of 1775 for the Second Continental Congress, I did not wear the fine silk coats of a wealthy planter. I wore my old blue and buff Virginia militia uniform. It was a silent, undeniable declaration of war. I felt the heavy, expectant gazes of the delegates bearing down upon me. When John Adams of Massachusetts rose to formally nominate me as the supreme commander of the newly formed Continental Army, the room went entirely still. I accepted the commission, refusing any salary, but I was consumed by a profound, suffocating dread. I stood before the assembly and confessed that I did not think myself equal to the command I was honored with. I knew that I was stepping onto a deadly scaffold. If I failed, my neck would stretch from a British hangman rope, and my name would be cursed as a traitor. I rode north to Cambridge, Massachusetts in July of 1775, expecting to take command of a functioning army. Instead, I found an armed, filthy, chaotic mob. The sickening stench of the encampment hit me before I even saw the canvas tents. Shallow latrines were dug dangerously close to the cooking fires. The summer air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and raw sewage. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, armed with rusty fowling pieces and an independent spirit that bordered on outright mutiny. Men from Massachusetts stubbornly refused to take orders from officers from Rhode Island or Connecticut. Discipline was completely non-existent. My heart sank into an abyss of despair. How could I possibly forge this squabbling rabble into a weapon capable of striking the greatest military power on Earth? I spent grueling months enforcing brutal discipline, ordering lashes for drunkenness and desertion, and forcing them to dig proper sanitation trenches. We were desperately, terrifyingly short of gunpowder. At one agonizing point, I was informed we had less than 9 rounds per man. If the British commander, General Gage, had attacked us then, the American Revolution would have ended in a single, bloody afternoon. But Providence intervened on our behalf. In the dead of winter, a young bookseller named Henry Knox accomplished the impossible. He dragged 59 heavy artillery pieces from Fort Ticonderoga across 300 miles of frozen mountains and treacherous rivers. I vividly remember the tense night we moved those massive iron beasts into position on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city of Boston. It was March of 1776. The moon was entirely hidden behind a thick veil of low clouds. We wrapped the heavy wagon wheels in straw to muffle their sound upon the frozen, unyielding earth. We worked in absolute, breathless silence. The only sounds were the quiet grunts of straining men and the harsh bite of the freezing wind. When the sun finally rose, the British awoke to find our cannons staring directly down into their anchored fleet. They had no choice but to evacuate the city. It was a bloodless, glorious victory. But I knew the real storm was yet to come. That storm broke violently over New York in the summer of 1776. I stood on the battery at the southern tip of Manhattan and watched the horizon turn into a terrifying forest of wooden masts. The mighty British Armada had arrived. Over 400 ships and 32,000 highly trained, battle-hardened professional soldiers, led by the Howe brothers, descended upon us. We were completely outmatched in every conceivable way. The very air smelled of salt water, hot tar, and impending doom. The Battle of Long Island in August was a catastrophic, bloody defeat. I watched through my brass spyglass, hot tears blurring my vision, as my brave Maryland troops charged repeatedly into a solid wall of British lead, sacrificing themselves to buy the rest of the army precious time to escape. The slaughter was unimaginable. The ground was slick with fresh blood, the air choking with thick white clouds of sulphurous powder smoke. I remember the foul taste of bile rising in my throat. We were hopelessly trapped in Brooklyn with our backs against the wide East River. The wind was against us. But then, as if the heavens themselves were shielding our fragile rebellion, a miraculous, unnaturally thick fog rolled in from the sea. It was so dense you could not see a man standing 6 feet away. Under the protective cover of this divine shroud, Colonel John Glover and his regiment of Marblehead Mariners ferried our entire army, our frightened horses, and our remaining heavy cannons across the treacherous river to Manhattan in complete, agonizing silence. We escaped total destruction, but the terrible retreat had just begun. For months, we were chased across New York and relentlessly driven down through New Jersey. It was a humiliating, agonizing withdrawal. The autumn rains were relentless, soaking my men to the bone. They lacked canvas tents, they lacked woolen blankets, and soon they completely lacked shoes. The freezing mud sucked at our broken boots, and morale plummeted into a dark, bottomless abyss. By December, as we crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, the Continental Army was rapidly disintegrating. Enlistments were set to formally expire at the end of the year. I had perhaps 3,000 exhausted, starving men left under my command. The flickering flame of liberty was nearly extinguished. Despair had a distinct scent in those days, a foul mixture of wet wool, rotting leaves, and the sour sweat of deeply fearful men. I knew that if I did not achieve a victory, any victory at all, the revolution would die a quiet death before the spring thaw. I made a desperate, terrifying gamble. I ordered the password for the night of December 25, 1776 to be "Victory or Death." Those 3 heavy words echoed the absolute finality of our dire situation. We marched back through the darkness to the snowy banks of the Delaware River. The weather was an absolute nightmare. A brutal winter storm had moved in, bringing a blinding mixture of snow, freezing rain, and howling winds. The river was a chaotic mass of churning black water and jagged, floating blocks of solid ice. I remember the rhythmic, violent thud of the ice crashing against the wooden hulls of the shallow draft boats as we crossed in the pitch-black night. The sleet drove directly into our faces like icy, stinging needles. Men were literally freezing to death in the boats. Once on the frozen New Jersey shore, we had to march 9 agonizing miles to Trenton. The snow was pristine and untouched, but as my men marched, I looked down and saw a long, continuous trail of bright crimson. My soldiers were marching barefoot, leaving their warm blood in the freezing snow. My heart broke, yet swelled with a fierce, protective pride for these ragged, unbreakable patriots. We descended upon Trenton just after dawn. The Hessian mercenaries, groggy and completely unprepared for an attack in such hellish weather, were taken entirely by surprise. The wet sleet had rendered many of our flintlock muskets useless, so I aggressively ordered my men to rely on the cold steel of the bayonet. The battle was brief, chaotic, and brutally decisive. We captured over 900 prisoners and suffered almost no casualties of our own. That desperate, freezing morning in Trenton breathed sudden life into a dying corpse. We miraculously followed it with another stunning victory at Princeton. We had survived the dark winter, but the war was destined to drag on for years of unrelenting hardship. None of our fierce battles, no exchange of musket fire or roaring cannonade, ever tested my soul as deeply as the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge. We marched into the desolate encampment just before Christmas, 12,000 men seeking shelter in a barren, frozen landscape. We had to build our own miserable city of log huts from the surrounding timber. The cold was a physical, malevolent presence, gnawing relentlessly at our fingers and toes until they turned black with creeping frostbite. Starvation was our constant, cruel companion. The civilian supply chain had completely collapsed. Men were boiling their own leather shoes and chewing on bitter tree bark just to have something in their empty stomachs. But the agonizing hunger was not the worst of it. It was the rampant disease. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox swept through the cramped camp like invisible, silent reapers. The stagnant air inside the damp, smoke-filled log huts was extremely thick with the foul, unforgettable stench of rotting flesh, diarrhea, and unwashed, dying bodies. I walked the snowy lines daily, stepping over frozen puddles of vomit and blood. I heard the deep, hacking coughs that tore at my men's chests, the delirious moans of the dying begging for their mothers. Surgeons amputated gangrenous limbs with dull, rusted saws, without a single drop of rum to dull the agonizing pain. The horrific screams echoed continuously through the snow-covered hills. I felt a profound, crushing weight of responsibility pressing down upon my chest. These men were dying horribly because they trusted me. I retreated to my headquarters, a small stone house, and I wept in the shadows. I rode out alone into the silent, snowy woods, dismounted from my great horse, and fell heavily to my knees in the pristine snow. The dampness seeped slowly through my heavy wool breeches as I prayed, begging the Almighty Providence to deliver my suffering men from this unparalleled hell. While we starved and froze, wealthy politicians in Congress bickered over petty promotions, and some of my own generals whispered venomously against me in the shadows, actively plotting to replace me. The bitter betrayal stung like a physical blow to the face. Yet, amidst this frozen purgatory, a miracle finally occurred in the form of a Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben. He arrived in camp, a loud, profane, energetic man who spoke almost no English. He drafted a rigorous manual of arms and drilled my ragged soldiers relentlessly day after day in the freezing mud. He aggressively taught them how to march in perfect unison, how to effectively use the bayonet, and how to maneuver swiftly as a cohesive military unit. We entered the frozen hell of Valley Forge as a bleeding, fragmented mob. But when the warm spring thaw finally came, we marched out proudly as a disciplined, hardened professional army. The years that followed were a grueling, endless test of physical and mental endurance. We fought fiercely in the blistering summer heat at Monmouth, where I lost my temper completely, screaming furiously at General Charles Lee for ordering a cowardly retreat, my voice hoarse with absolute rage amidst the suffocating powder smoke and the deafening roar of bouncing artillery. We endured more freezing winters at Morristown, cold so deep it cracked the bark on the trees. Winters even worse than Valley Forge. The national economy entirely collapsed. Violent mutinies flared among the unpaid, starving troops, and the dark, treacherous stain of Benedict Arnold's treason nearly shattered my weary spirit. He was one of my finest fighting generals, a man I trusted implicitly with the very life of the Republic. When I learned he had sold the fortress of West Point to the British for gold, I felt a cold, jagged dagger plunge deep into my back. I looked around my quiet camp and wondered who else might be wearing a false mask of loyalty. But we stubbornly held the line. We simply refused to die. And then, in the late summer of 1781, the final, glorious pieces of the grand chessboard fell perfectly into place. A massive Allied French fleet sailed proudly into the Chesapeake Bay, entirely cutting off the British escape by sea, while my combined American and French army marched rapidly south to the coast of Virginia. We securely trapped the entire British army under General Cornwallis at a small, dusty tobacco port called Yorktown. The bloody siege of Yorktown was the ultimate culmination of 8 long years of blood, mud, and unimaginable sacrifice. The warm autumn air was heavy and thick with the pungent smell of sulfur, burning wood, and the raw, metallic tang of blood. We dug deep, parallel trenches in the sandy soil, moving systematically closer and closer to the heavily fortified British lines under the protective cover of absolute darkness. The roar of the Allied French and American artillery was a constant, deafening thunder that shook the very earth beneath our worn boots. I clearly remember standing tall in an exposed trench, watching the relentless bombardment tear the enemy earthworks to pieces. A heavy iron cannonball struck the dirt parapet just a few feet away, showering my nervous officers and me with a heavy rain of dark mud and jagged stones. A young, terrified aide begged me to step back to safety, warning desperately that the position was far too exposed. I simply looked at him and calmly told him that if he was afraid, he was entirely free to step back. I could not tear my eyes away from the fiery destruction of the British defenses. I proudly watched young Alexander Hamilton lead a daring, reckless night assault on Redoubt No. 10, charging fiercely with unloaded muskets to strictly maintain the element of surprise, relying entirely on the cold, lethal steel of the bayonet. The violent victory was swift and absolute. On the 19th of October, 1781, the massive siege guns finally fell completely silent. It was an eerie, surreal, almost deafening quiet. The defeated British army marched out of their shattered, smoking defenses to formally surrender their arms. Over 7,000 professional soldiers in soiled, torn red coats, their heads bowed in deep humiliation, laying down their heavy muskets in a massive, clattering pile. The British military band played a melancholy, mournful tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." I sat tall upon my great white horse, looking out over the vast sea of surrendered enemies and victorious, openly weeping American patriots. The totally impossible dream had been finally realized. The mighty, globe-spanning British Empire had been broken by an exhausted army of farmers, shoemakers, and tradesmen. Yet my absolute most difficult battle was still looming ahead of me. It was not against ranks of redcoats or ruthless Hessians, but against the deeply seductive, intoxicating allure of absolute power. By 1783, the brutal war was officially over, but the new republic was in a fragile, incredibly perilous state. The Congress was entirely bankrupt, and my suffering army had not been paid in years. The veteran officers, men who had bled freely and starved willingly for the sacred cause, were utterly furious. They gathered ominously in Newburgh, New York, actively circulating treasonous letters that openly called for a military coup against the civilian government. They wanted to march aggressively on Congress, to use their bloody swords to forcefully take the money they were rightly owed, and some even wished to place a crown upon my head. The dark temptation of power has destroyed countless fledgling republics throughout human history. When I walked slowly into the wooden meeting hall at Newburgh, the stale air was thick with dangerous tension and barely suppressed rage. The men I loved deeply, the brave men I had led through the fires of hell, were glaring at me with hardened, unforgiving eyes. I stepped up to the plain wooden lectern and began to read a prepared speech, begging them to remain steadfastly loyal to the fragile republic, to not drown the glorious revolution in the dark blood of a military dictatorship. But my desperate words were clearly failing to move them. I could tangibly feel the entire revolution slipping away, perfectly poised to collapse into a terrible, bloody tyranny of our own making. I paused my speech. I slowly reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out a delicate pair of spectacles. I had never worn them in public before that precise moment. A soft, surprised murmur ran swiftly through the angry crowd. I looked out at my hardened, scarred officers and spoke very softly. I gently told them to please forgive me, for I had grown not only gray, but almost entirely blind in the long service of my country. In that single, profoundly vulnerable moment, the violent anger in the room simply vanished like smoke in the wind. Hardened, scarred veterans, men who had fearlessly charged roaring cannons and watched their own brothers die in agony, began to weep openly and unashamedly. The dangerous mutiny died right there in that quiet wooden hall, killed not by the force of arms, but by a powerful, shared memory of our collective, agonizing sacrifice. In December of 1783, I traveled wearily to Annapolis, where the Continental Congress was meeting in session. I stood proudly before the silent assembly, the grand room completely hushed, and I slowly drew the heavy iron sword that had been faithfully at my side through 8 years of unrelenting, bloody war. I formally and completely resigned my supreme commission as Commander-in-Chief. I peacefully surrendered all my worldly power back to the fragile civilian government. It was an unprecedented act that thoroughly baffled the wealthy, entrenched monarchs of Europe. King George III of England supposedly said that if I truly gave up such immense power, I would be the greatest man in the whole world. But to my soul, it was the absolute only possible choice. I had not fought desperately through the snow and the mud to replace one distant tyrant with a local one. I fought solely so that the free people could govern themselves in liberty. I mounted my waiting horse and rode quietly away from the cheering crowds, away from the echoing drums and the smoking cannons, turning my tired face toward the familiar, muddy, peaceful banks of the Potomac River. As I finally rode up the long, crunching gravel driveway of Mount Vernon, arriving just in time to spend a quiet Christmas with Martha, I felt a profound, deeply exhausting peace settle deep into my aching bones. I was a simple citizen once more. The great guns were finally silent. The new republic was breathing steadily on its own, and the crushing weight of the entire world had finally been lifted from my weary, aging shoulders. I fully knew that the uncharted future of this new nation would be fraught with intense peril, that bitter political factions would inevitably tear at its delicate seams, and that the dark, unforgiving, tragic sin of slavery, which I myself was hopelessly and guiltily entangled in, would one day threaten to violently rip the country apart. But in that quiet, freezing winter twilight, smelling the deeply familiar, comforting scent of burning wood smoke and damp pine needles, I allowed myself to simply close my tired eyes and listen to the beautiful silence. We had successfully crossed the freezing river. We had survived the long, bitter, bloody night, and the bright morning sun was finally beginning to rise over a free nation. Looking back on those tumultuous years, I often marvel at the profoundly fragile thread upon which our grand experiment hung. The freezing water of that treacherous river was only the absolute beginning of a long and agonizing journey toward true independence. We fought our way through unimaginable winters, surviving endless betrayals and enduring the constant, gnawing hunger that relentlessly stalked our humble camps. Yet, against all earthly odds, we prevailed. When the war finally ended and I surrendered my military commission to the Congress, returning the ultimate power to the people, I desperately believed I could simply return to my beloved land. I genuinely yearned for the quiet, peaceful life of a humble farmer, wanting nothing more than to walk the sprawling fields of my estate and peacefully watch the changing seasons. But duty called my name once more, pulling me back into the fierce, unpredictable current of building a completely new republic from the ground up. Serving as the first leader of this newly born nation was a tremendous burden, far heavier than any iron sword I had ever carried into battle. Every single decision I made, and every single precedent I established, felt as though it was being permanently carved into the eternal stone of human history. I fully knew the watchful eyes of the entire world were upon us, eagerly waiting for us to crumble, expecting a new tyrant to violently rise from the smoldering ashes of our rebellion. I solemnly resolved never to become that tyrant. I consciously chose to step away after 8 exhausting years, hoping to show the world that supreme power could indeed be relinquished peacefully and voluntarily. That peaceful transfer of authority was perhaps my greatest victory, far greater than any bloody triumph achieved on a battlefield. But my personal legacy remains a complex tapestry woven with both blinding light and deep, haunting shadows. The glorious freedom we fought so desperately to proudly secure was tragically not granted to all who lived upon our soil. The very cruel institution I was born into, the exact one I participated in and profited from, remained a terribly dark stain upon the very soul of the young republic. I knew, even as I proudly signed our founding documents, that the brutal hypocrisy of holding men and women in permanent bondage while loudly declaring absolute liberty for all humanity would eventually exact a truly terrible toll. In my final earthly days, The heavy weight of this moral contradiction pressed relentlessly upon my weary conscience. I formally arranged for the ultimate emancipation of those I enslaved upon my wife passing away. A quiet, perhaps inadequate attempt to finally balance the scales of divine justice before I inevitably faced my Maker. I always knew it was simply not enough. I deeply knew a violent storm was slowly gathering, a massive storm that would one terrible day threaten to tear the entire nation apart. As the bitter winter of 1799 slowly descended upon my home, bringing with it a fierce and unforgiving chill, I clearly felt my own end steadily drawing near. The immense physical strength that had miraculously sustained me through brutal wars and bitter political strife finally began to wane completely. Lying quietly in my bed, listening to the freezing wind howl violently against the glass window panes, my fading mind drifted back to those desperate, freezing nights in the deep snow. I vividly remembered the youthful faces of the brave men who sadly never lived to see the bright spring of our independence. I hoped, with every single fiber of my fading spirit, that the fragile republic we bled for would somehow endure its future trials. I sincerely prayed that the generations to come would possess the courage and wisdom to slowly perfect the deeply flawed union we left behind. When my breathing finally grew shallow and short, and the dark shadows lengthened across my quiet room, I felt a profound, overriding sense of deep peace. I had willingly given absolutely everything I possessed to my beloved country. I closed my tired eyes for the very last time, completely trusting the uncertain future to the capable hands of the free people. Thank you for traveling through history with us. Subscribe to Lumen of Ages for more tales.